Well, we can get started. Okay. Hello, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your patience. It's good to see you all. Before we get started, just a quick little reminder, if you can mute your microphones and if you can turn off the video so that we can get started with the class. Okay? Okay. So welcome back, everyone. So good to see you. Hope you've been enjoying the now nice transition into fall and making use of some of your great Ayurvedic skills and tips that you've learned now over the past few months, especially since we're in the seasonal transition period. And I'm pretty sure all of you hopefully you've all had a chance to do the cleanse that Kate has been leading you on. So you're getting to experience firsthand the effects of these new skills that you've acquired. Okay, so great. So today we're going to continue on with our review for the fundamentals aspect and for your exam. I do have a PowerPoint which I had mentioned to you last time in class, and in that it has a lot of the questions that are there in the study guide and in the review, the review sheet. It's kind of covered in most of these slides. So if you have your study guide sheet with you with the list of questions, you could keep that on the side and you can probably just tick off the things that we're going to be completing today. And if we don't get a chance to cover all of it, we do have another webinar in 2 weeks and we'll be able to finish up then. We'll have more than enough time to finish all of the material as well as be able to get to some of your questions. Okay, so if we don't finish all of it today, we'll continue on in the next webinar. Okay, so let's just get started. I'll just switch to share my screen here with you guys. Okay. Okay. So there we go. So the first question on your review sheet is the definition of health as per Ayurveda. And we did cover this in class, but I saw a few people ask this as well, so I'm just going to review it once again. It is there within the chapter, as well as it is in chapter 12 at the end of the book, at the end of your manual that has it with the Sanskrit verse, as well as the transliteration. So this is there in both aspects of the book, if you're looking at just the doshas as well as, or maintenance of health, as well as in the 12th chapter, okay? So the definition of health, this is mentioned by Shushruta Acharya, which is one of the major teachers or foreseers or experts of Ayurveda. And in his textbook, he's defined health as Sama dosha, sama agnischa, sama dhatu malakriya, prasanna atma indriya manaha swasta itya bhidiyate. That means sama dosha. Here, remember again, sama means balance. It's not sama, which means sama means with ama. In this situation or in this context, it is sama. They're two different words. Sama means balance. So when you have a balance of the doshas, which is ideally what we've been looking at, and different methods and different tools that you can do, you can adopt in order to keep the balance of your doshas, right? So the balance of vata, pitta, and kapha, and to that which is normal to an individual. So what does that mean? That means that, for instance, if a person is, remember we talked about this, if a person is kapha prakriti, or if they're pitta prakriti, or if they're vata prakriti, that means that they're naturally going to have a predominance or a higher level of that corresponding dosha. Or in the case of if there are two doshas, they're always going to be in that particular permutation. However, that permutation is their balance, okay? So for instance, if you're a vata prakriti person, and you have pitta as your secondary dosha and kapha as your third dosha, that balance of Vata being number 1, Pitta being number 2, and Kapha being number 3, or in that particular quantity, that is their normal. So that is considered as the Samadosha for them. As long as the doshas are functioning appropriately in that person, without causing any imbalance, without causing any aggravated signs of Vata, Pitta, or Kapha, and without causing any issues with a decreased version of Vata, Pitta, Kapha, then that is considered as Samadosha, or that is considered as the balance of the doshas. So in the simplest way to put it is, Samadosha means a balance of doshas, okay? Next is Sama Agni. We looked at extensively the importance of Agni and how that has to play in a person's nutrition as well as the maintenance of their health, because nutrition is sort of the basic building block upon where a person's health or the lack thereof is determined. So the Agni, and this is referring basically to the Jatra Agni, as well as all the other types of Agnis, but as we had talked about earlier as well, the Jatra Agni is that which helps to control or maintain the functioning of all the other Agnis, okay? So we want to have a Sama Agni, or a balanced intensity and functioning of Agni. So remember, if we looked at the intensity of Agni, there are 4 different types. There is Tikshna Agni, which means it's very high or very strong Agni. There's Manda Agni, where it's very slow or very low Agni. There is Vishama Agni, which means it's very irregular, sometimes high, sometimes low. And then there's Sama Agni, which means it's balanced. Okay, so that is the type of Agni that we want to have in a healthy person. If somebody has that, that is one more factor that is conducive to health. Okay, the next is Samadhatu. So that means that, again, we want a balance of the dhatus. More specifically, we want a balance of the functioning, because dhatus are the functional aspects of the body. They are the tissues that help to carry out the specific functions of the doshas. So we want to make sure that those dhatus are being formed properly. They're able to help in carrying out the functions of the doshas. They have their own functions for sustenance. All of those are functioning in the appropriate time and quantity and measure. Okay, so basically the balance of the 7 dhatus. Okay, the next is Samamala. We want to make sure that there is a balance again of the malas. Malas are equally important as the doshas and the dhatus, because those are the byproducts or the end products of the processes that are being carried out by the doshas and dhatus. So which means that they're not exactly just waste. It's not just a waste that needs to be thrown out, but it has a function there as well, which means it needs to be produced at an appropriate quantity, and it needs to also be excreted at the appropriate time. So Samamala, basically what we mean by balance of the malas is that they're being formed, they're carrying out their functions, as well as they're being excreted out of the body at the appropriate time. Okay, so that's what we want to look at when we say we want a balance of the malas, or the balance of the waste products. We want to make sure that they're carrying out those particular functions as well. Then the last part is, so that is looking at the physical body. Okay, the Samadosha, Sama Agni, Samadhatu, and Samamala is looking at the physical body. Whereas there's also the aspect of the subtle body that is equally important to a person being healthy or non-healthy. Okay, so they've described this as Prasanna Atma Indriya Manaha. Prasanna Atma, Prasanna means contentment or happiness. So you want to make sure that the Atma, or you can consider this as the spirit or the soul, basically the underlying force or energy that is there in a person that drives a person, that needs to be contented, that needs to be happy, it needs to be able to, you need to be doing something that is fulfilling its purpose. Okay, So there should be prasannata of that, of the spirit, prasannata or contentment and happiness of the Atma. Then also prasannata of the Indriyas or contentment of the sensory organs. Indriyas means the sensory organs. There are two types of sensory organs, ones which where we gain knowledge from, which are known as the jnana indriyas. And there's also the sensory organs which carry out karmas, which are known as the karma indriyas. Okay? So both of these aspects or both of these divisions or types of senses need to also be contented. They need to be happy, which means you need to do the appropriate type of actions that is usually carried out by those particular organs. Okay? And the last is you want to have prasannata of the mind, which is very, very crucial, as we know. The mind needs to be happy. It needs to be contented. We need to do things that will help to strengthen and to create a uniform flow and intensity of the mind. Okay? So by looking at all of these aspects, if all of this is in balance, then a person is considered or defined as healthy. And it may seem like this is impossible, that there is no one out there who falls under this definition, but that's not true. I have met quite a few people, very surprisingly, and it was very much a treat for me, but there are people out there who do fall under this definition. And they basically lead a very healthy life. And they don't necessarily need to know Ayurveda to do that. There were a few people that I met that were coming to me for the first time. They just wanted to find out what there is in Ayurveda. But there was a woman who was 65 years old, and she completely was the embodiment of this definition of health as per Ayurveda. So it's out there, and it's definitely possible. But it's just that sometimes if we fall into the variance or the non-definition of health, then it's sometimes depending on how far gone we are, it may take that much work to get back to this particular state of health. Okay, so that's the first question on your review list. The second is looking at the 24 aspects described by Sankhya Darshana, which is looking at evolution. Okay, so these 24 aspects is basically what is described here. So in that, Purusha and Prakriti is considered as one, because only by the joining of the Purusha and Prakriti, these two, then there can be creation. It's the similar concept of looking at, you can say partially like the masculine and the feminine energies that are combining together in order to form creation. Okay, it's not exactly like that, but in looking at this, the crude definition of Purusha and Prakriti, Purusha typically is associated with the masculine sense, and Prakriti is associated with the feminine. Okay, so these two combined together, it generates or starts this process of evolution. From that comes Buddhi. When there is something that we're looking at, in here described as consciousness and the primordial matter. When these two combine, then that forms a certain principle. And principle in looking at pure nature or knowledge. Remember we were talking about pure knowledge or true knowledge is never destroyed? This is what we're saying, that this pure knowledge or true knowledge is always existence. In order for us to understand or for its existence to be known, it needs a substratum. And the substratum is nothing but the primordial nature or the primordial matter that starts up. This is very similar to what is explained in physics, where they talk about the fact that all matter is energy. That energy is nothing but what is described here by the combination of Purusha and Prakriti. That's the energy. And the energy, once we are able to understand, or the nuances of that energy, is basically described in the Mahat, or be basically described in the pure sense or information, or the the qualities that are described about that particular substance. From that, when a substance is formed and it starts to then disintegrate, or it starts to divide, or it starts to transform, then it starts to separate. It's no longer one big massive form of energy, but then it starts to separate into smaller. So when you start to separate from one to become many, then that many starts to get its own individuality, right? So in the sense of it getting its own individuality, that's how you get ahankara, because ahankara means exactly that. It means allowing self-identity, or the ego. Ego not necessarily in the bad sense, but in the sense of it being separate or having its own identity. So just as you have in this aspect, it is still considered as one. It's still one primordial matter or one primordial energy. But when it starts to then transform and separate, then you get separate little parts of that. So then you can separate, this is the first one, this is the second one, this is the third one, this is the fourth one. Then it can get a chance to have a name and form, right? So that's how it develops ahankara. From ahankara, depending on the qualities. Now, sattva, rajas, tamas is not really included in there because they're not actual matter, okay? They're not actual matter, but they're qualities. So according to the qualities that are then being transformed from this ahankara, that's how we end up with these actual physical matter that's down here. In this aspect, this is more physical, whereas this is more metaphysical. So here, according to the qualities of the matter that's being formed, then it can be described as that which is originating with more of the sattvika qualities, and that develops into the mind and the other indriyas. These are basically 11 indriyas, which is the 5 jnana indriyas, or the cognitive senses, the 5 karma indriyas, or the 5 active instruments, and then the mind. So that's 11. Okay, and that basically comes down from the sattvika quality. And from the sattvika quality, depending on how much of rajasika is combining with it, you may have variations according to the types or the qualities that are exhibiting in these senses. Okay, next you have from this ahankara in the more tamasika quality being that which is more stable or solid or more gross, then you actually end up getting the more gross elements, because even these tend to be more subtle in comparison to these, right? They still have physical entities and physical existence, but in actuality, their physical nature is much more subtle in comparison to these. Okay, so from here, from this tamasika quality, you end up with the 5 subtle elements or the tanmatras, and then you end up with the 5 mahabhutas or the 5 gross elements, which are those which we know as the 5 elements that represent in the doshas. So these are the 24 tattvas that are described in Sankhya Darshana. And in that, basically, the same aspect of process of evolution of the universe is the same process of evolution of the human being. Okay? So these are the 24 that you do need to know. Prakriti, Buddhi, Ahankara, Manas, 5 cognitive sense or 5 jnana indriyas, 5 karma indriyas, 5 tanmatras, and 5 mahabhutas. Okay, so there you go. Those are the 24 tattvas.
Of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Thanks for joining us.
If you wouldn't mind muting your microphone so that there wouldn't be as much feedback, that would be great. So in looking at this, what we've just described, now we can see how there is a correlation between the macrocosm and the microcosm. So the macrocosm has the same process of evolution as that in the microcosm, which is the human being, is a much smaller, tinier version of the larger universe. And in that, looking at the physical world and how it exists and how it carries out its own functions, similarly, those functions are carried out in the human being. And looking at the physical matter of the body, it is basically made out of these 5 elements. And that which is Akasha, Vayu, Agni, Jala, and Prithvi, or space, air, fire, water, and earth. Okay? So these are the elements that are present in the human body.
It's really warm outside.
And there was a question, actually a few people asked this question of looking at how these doshas are being formed from the 5 elements. So this is important because there isn't actually a process in where they're forming, but there is a process in how the elements themselves evolve. So remember we had talked about akasha or space being the most subtle of the 5 elements. So this is formed first. Then from there, you have the formation of air, because wherever there is space, once there is, again, transformation, something is being made, something is developing. So in that space, it needs space in order for it to exist. It needs to be able to occupy a space. In that space, then it starts to move. You ever notice when something is being transformed or something is being made, the first thing, it needs movement, right? You need to move something. It can't stay stagnant in order to be made. So in that space, you get that movement, and that's how you end up. That movement is nothing but the vayu, or the air element. Okay, so whenever there's movement, this movement starts. The more the movement that occurs, then it creates friction, which creates heat, or the fire element. From this fire element, as it's growing and growing, as the fire tends to be more predominant, it condenses and then forms the water element. And then the combination of all these other 4 elements in the most grossest form is the earth element. So from that, that's how we end up looking at the akasha, or the space and air. These 2 combined is what is represented in the body as vata. So in the physical body, we have all 5 elements, and they're not exclusive to each other. In every single substance, in every single matter, even within the body, you will have all 5 elements. That's why here, if you look at this picture, I have all 5 elements. I haven't separated them out to say only these 2 are vata. All 5 elements are there, existent in all matter, in all physical matter. However, that which is predominant, the places or the areas or the functions that are being carried out that are predominant with this space and air element is represented by vata dosha. So this is how we understand the presence or the importance of this space and air element in the body. So for instance, in places like, for instance, in the intestines, it's basically a channel, right? And in order for things to move in that channel, it needs space and it needs movement or air. So we know vata actually moves. Vata is representing that space and air element in the body. That's how we know that vata is there. So this is the reason why we can say vata is predominant in the intestines, or in the colon, where there is a more amount of space and movement. Okay, similarly, vata is predominant in the bones, in the spaces within the bones, because if you look at inside of the bones, the shaft of the bone, or if you look at the bone marrow, there are lots of tiny little spaces, right? So those tiny little spaces are, again, representative of the space element. And the actual movement that occurs within that to help to produce other things is basically that of the air element. So there also vata is predominant. Okay, similarly in the lungs, we have more space and we have movement. So that is another area where vata is predominant. Okay, so looking at these, if we were to decipher each and every area where we attribute vata dosha to, you're going to find the space and air element there. Either one or both in combination, they're carrying out some functions there. Okay, so that is how we get vata dosha from space and air elements. And the qualities that are associated with vata dosha: ruksha or dry, laghu or light, shita or cold, kara or rough, sukshma or minute, and chala or movement. Okay. The next we have is Pitta. So Pitta dosha is basically comprised of or made up of the fire and water elements. Because even in this fire element, it is predominantly the fire element, but it does have certain aspects of the water element as well. Because Pitta in itself is not just fire. It is in the form of a liquid. It is more in a moist form than in just a fire form. So it carries out its fiery functions through a liquid media. That's why we say Pitta is a combination of fire and water. Okay, so in all of the aspects of the body where you have functions that are being carried out by fire, which is basically represented by transformation, metabolism, catabolic activity, that is all done by Pitta. Okay, so there we can look at, if we look at the qualities or the gunas associated with Pitta, they are sasneha, it's slightly unctuous. Tikshna, it's very penetrating. Ushna, which is hot. Laghu, which is light. Visram, which means it has a slightly bad odor, which typically tends to happen when you have heat and moisture combined. Sada, which is free-flowing. It moves very easily. And Drava, it's fluidity. Okay, so these are the qualities associated with Pitta. Next, we have Kapha dosha. So Kapha is the most gross, stable, and strong, means physically strong, of the three doshas. So that is represented by the water and earth elements. So in that, again, the combination, we're going from the most subtle to the intermediate to the most gross and stable of the doshas. Okay? So in that, water and earth helps to form the Kapha dosha, which has qualities such as snigdha or unctuous, shita or cold, guru or heavy, manda or slow, slakshana, which means it's slightly slimy or slippery, mritsna is slimy, and sthira, which means it's stable. Okay? So these are the qualities of the doshas. So next, if we look at the doshas and dhatus in conjunction, the dosha takes care of the physiological aspect of the body, whereas the dhatus, they carry out, they're actually considered as the anatomical aspect of the body, where they have the physical structure. And even those structures have functions in the fact that they provide certain stability for these physiological aspects to carry out their functions, right? So for instance, if you have machinery, okay, or you have a particular instrument in your kitchen that is supposed to do a particular function, you need to have the instrument in order to do the function, right? So the function is, for instance, grinding. So you have like a food processor. So the food processor itself, the container, the blades, all of those are the physical structures, or you could consider that the dhatu. And the movement aspect, or that which actually helps to grind, the function it carries out is that of the dosha. So the movement part, or the breaking apart aspect of it that is carried out by the food processor, that's kind of like the dosha. Whereas the physical part of it, the actual container, the actual blades, the things that are tangible, those are the dhatus. Similarly, the doshas aren't necessarily always tangible, like vata isn't necessarily something tangible, but all these dhatus are tangible substances. These are things that we can hold, we can extract, we can show an actual picture, or you can take this out of the body and say, okay, so this is rasa dhatu, this is rakta dhatu, like so on and so forth. So these are physical structures where those are more physiological functions. They carry out certain functions in the body, and they manage all the functions in the body. Okay? So you have vata, pitta, and kapha, the doshas, and you have the dhatus here, which are rasa or plasma. It's sort of loosely translated as that, as plasma. Rakta, which is blood. Mamsa, which is muscle tissue. Medas is fatty tissue. Asti is bony tissue. It also includes cartilage. Majja is bone marrow and nervous tissue, and Shukra Dhatu is the reproductive tissue. Okay. And usually you want to study them in this particular order because this is in the typical order of generation or nutrition. So for instance, remember when we were talking about why nutrition is the basis for a person's body's health and formation of health or the status of their health? It's because whatever we eat gets then transformed into these particular dhatus, and it gets formed in this exact same manner or in this particular order. So that's why whatever we eat, the food that we eat, has to have enough nutrition and substance in order to be able to nourish and transform and help to carry out the functions of these particular dhatus. Okay. So next is digestion, which is the question of what is define Agni. Define Agni is basically the digestive fire, and that is usually in reference to the Jatra Agni. The Jatra Agni is the main Agni. There are also 13 types of Agnis. Of that, they have 7 Dhatva Agnis and 5 Bhuta Agnis, or 5 Agnis for each one of the elements, and then the Jatra Agni. So that's 13 different types of Agnis. Okay, of that, Jatra Agni is the most important one because that's what helps to control the intensity and the functioning of all the other Agnis. Okay, so looking at this, we had talked about this as well in class where we looked at what we consume, our food being consumed. It is broken down and processed here by this particular Agni. And then it gets, from here, it exits out of the stomach, and then it starts to go on to the dhatus. So it goes into the dhatu shrotas, and from there, that particular dhatu Agni will help to break it down further and help to nourish the already existing dhatu, as well as help in formation of new dhatu or new tissues. Okay, so just like any other tissue in the body that we typically look at, tissues are constantly being generated, and that which was already been generated decomposes and gets excreted out. Okay, so it is a constant recurrent process. Similarly, in Ayurveda, we look at the same thing. These dhatus, they have those which are being formed, then they have a particular lifespan, and then they decompose and they excrete out. And so we have, those are known as these Thayi and as Thayi dhatus. That which is already formed, which is a stable dhatu, and that which is being newly formed, which is Asthayi. It is immature. It hasn't completely matured or completely formed yet. So what we eat is so important because that's what helps to transform and help to nourish the existing rasadhatu, as well as help in the production of formation of new rasadhatu. Okay, and from there on, it goes on to then nourish the rakta and mamsa, meda, asti, maja, shukra in this particular order. The final essence, or the last product, or the last part of digestion of what we get from this whole process is known as ojas, which is basically the factor that helps to represent our body's own immunity or our body's strength, which is known as vyadikshamatva or bala, the person's innate strength or ability to fight off or to prevent disease, which is basically immunity. Okay, so immunity is very much dependent on the quality and production and sustenance of this ojas. And as you can see here, ojas is the end product of, or the final essence of this whole process of digestion and nutrition. Okay, so hence, again, why nutrition is so important and so essential is because it basically takes care of every aspect and every function that is there in the body. Okay. So looking at this, what are the components in our food? We have different components in our food that help us to determine how our body is going to react to that. Okay. So whether it's good food or it's bad food, if it's good for us, if it's good for me, not good for you, what determines that? It is determined by these particular components. Okay, so these components are known as the 5 qualities of food. We use this word qualities in different contexts and looking at how we can help to understand different components of a particular object and how it functions, okay? So in looking at food, there is the rasa or the taste, the guna or qualities. Here also we look at qualities, virya or the potency, vipaka, the post-digestive effect, and the prabhava or the specialized pharmaceutical activity, okay? So looking at that, we have 6 tastes that are described in Ayurveda. We have sweet, which is madhura, sour, which is amla, sweet, which sour, which is amla, salty, which is lavana, pungent, which is katu, tikta, which is bitter is tikta, and astringent is kashaya, okay? So it's good to either to remember it in this order if you can, or at least to know these 3 groupings, you know, sour, salty, sweet, sour, and salty, pungent, bitter, and astringent, because it kind of gives away the answers as to how it affects the doshas. So it's a nice little trick to remember it in this order, okay? Or if you can at least kind of remember this picture, it'll help to answer a good few of your questions. So you have sweet, the components of sweet or madhura rasa it's composed of the earth and water elements. And if you look at this earth and water element is also the same composition of kapha. So therefore, naturally, it's going to increase kapha. It is one of the best and quickest ways to increase kapha, okay? Similarly, sour taste or amla rasa is comprised of the earth and fire element. So the reason why here it can aggravate kapha is because of the composition or the existence of the earth element, because that is also a element or a composition that is present in kapha. Okay, so that's why sour taste also aggravates kapha. The next is salty or lavana. Lavana is comprised of the water and fire elements. Okay, so because of that, it also, because of its existence or a component of water, it also can aggravate kapha. So in looking at all three of these have the same components that are there in kapha, but of them, sweet is the closest in composition to kapha, same exact composition. That's why sweet substances immediately aggravate kapha, or they increase kapha. Like increases like. So sweet can increase kapha. Make sense now? Okay. So the next three is pungent or katu. Katu is comprised of fire and air elements. Okay, so the fire and air, because of the air component in katu, it actually helps to aggravate vata, because vata is made up of the air and space elements. Similarly, tikta rasa is made up of air and space. So here also, if you look at tikta rasa or bitter, it is composed of the exact same components of vata dosha. Therefore, tikta rasa is one of the best ways to aggravate vata, because of the fact that it has the same composition of vata dosha. Next is astringent or kashaya rasa, and kashaya rasa is made up of air and earth. So here, even though it does have the earth component, but it does have air as well. So because of the fact that it is composed of air element, it also aggravates vata. Okay? So if we look at this, those which aggravate kapha because of having like qualities or like composition of kapha are also the same reason why it helps to pacify vata. Okay, so these first three, they aggravate kapha because of its likeness, and they pacify vata because of its opposite qualities. Similarly, the last three, pungent, bitter, and astringent, they aggravate vata because of its like qualities or its like composition, and they pacify kapha because of its opposite qualities or opposite composition. So does that tend to make sense now? You can see here, these are similar in composition to kapha. They exhibit the same sort of qualities, that they are more heavy in nature, more moist, more unctuous, whereas those which aggravate vata are more light, are more drying. And because of that, it aggravates vata, but also those are the opposite to that of kapha, so it pacifies kapha. Okay, so that's where it stands in how these tastes affect these two doshas. Now, what about pitta? Now, pitta is fairly easy. Pitta is easy if you remember this composition. Any taste that has the fire element aggravates pitta, and those which do not have the fire element pacify pitta. So therefore, sour, salty, and pungent all have fire element in their composition. Therefore, sour, salty, pungent aggravate pitta. Sweet, bitter, and astringent does not have the fire element in its composition. Therefore, sweet, bitter, and astringent pacify pitta. So does that make sense now? Hopefully it should be, there should be some light bulbs going off. Oh, okay, I understand now. So even though this seems like a lot to study and it seems a bit complicated, but if you get this basic combination, the rest of it to answer the questions are very logical, okay? So that's how we look at the 6 tastes and the effects on the doshas. The next is the qualities. And so these 20 gunas, or the Vimshati gunas, you know very well, but we'll just go over it very quickly once again. So the 20 qualities or gunas are Guru, which is heavy, and the opposite to that is Lagu or light. Manda is slow, and the opposite is Tikshna, which is very sharp. Hima or Shita is cold, and the opposite of that is Ushna or hot. Please forgive the spelling of these, because when I wrote this was for people who are not used to the diacriticals and the Sanskrit writing, so I wrote it as how you would pronounce it or how you would spell it if you didn't know those diacritical marks. So the spellings here may seem a little bit different, but it was only because I had written it out for a very general audience who has never been exposed to Sanskrit before, okay? So there may be some spelling differences, but that's only because this is how it's pronounced, not necessarily with the diacriticals. Okay, so next is Hima or Shita, which is cold, and Ushna, which is hot. Snigdha or Sneha, which is oily, and the opposite of that is Ruksha or dry. Sandra, which means it's very dense, whereas Drava means it's more liquidy nature. Mridu means soft, whereas the opposite of that is Kathina or hard. Chala is that which is mobile or moving, whereas Thira means that which is static. Sthula means it's gross or big, and Sukshma means it's subtle or small. Pichila means it's cloudy or opaque, whereas Vishada means it's clear. Okay? So that's all the 20 gunas, or the Vimshati gunas. The next is looking at Virya and Vipaka. So here again, if we look at the taste, or we remember that composition, here again makes it very easy. Just as we looked at those, the Virya is those which are, there are 2 types of Virya. There is hot and cold, or Ushna and Shita. So therefore, those which aggravate Pitta will be Ushna Virya, and those which pacify Pitta will be Shita Virya. Okay? Does that again make sense? There you go. Very easy. That which has the fire element is hot. That which does not have the fire element is cold. Next is looking at the Vipaka. The Vipaka is the post-digestive effect. So just looking at what it changes to, we have sweet and salty transforms to a sweet post-digestive effect or a Madhura Vipaka. Sour transforms to a sour digestive effect or Amla Vipaka. And pungent, bitter, and astringent transform to a pungent or a Katu Vipaka. So what does that mean? There was a question of what I didn't completely understand what Vipaka means, or how do we get that? Why is that important? Well, when we say post-digestive effect, we're looking at the later stages of digestion. And in a second, I will describe what are the stages of digestion. But Vipaka basically means how, after the food is broken down and it starts to get assimilated, how does it start to then affect the doshas? Okay, not just which dosha is predominant at the stage of digestion, but how this food is now starting to affect the doshas. So for instance, sweet and salty, which have a Madhura Vipaka or a sweet post-digestive effect, what that means is, because it is predominantly sweet afterwards or after breaking down, it will aggravate kapha. It tends to be more heavy or guru. It promotes the shukra dhatu. It also helps in proper elimination of stool, urine, and gas. Okay, so that whenever we look at what the food that we're consuming, or the spices that we're consuming, or even the different herbs that we may be consuming, this vipaka does help in understanding how that particular substance is going to affect the doshas. So that which transforms to Madhura Vipaka will have this particular effect on the dosha. Okay. The next is Amla Vipaka. So basically looking at sour substances. Sour substances tend to transform to a Amla Vipaka. Therefore, that aggravates pitta. It tends to be more light. It reduces Shukra Dhatu. And it also helps in proper elimination of stools and urine. Okay, so that is all sour substances. And in looking at the last three, which is bitter, pungent, and astringent, or tikta katu kashaya, that has a katu vipaka or a pungent vipaka. And what that does, the effect on the dosha that it has is it aggravates vata. It is more light in comparison to Madhura. It reduces Shukra Dhatu because of the fact that it's very light and airy. It doesn't have much substance for nourishment. And also, instead of the others, it obstructs the passage of stool, urine, and gas due to its drying effects. Okay? It does not allow for normal, healthy, or promote elimination of those waste products, but instead it dries up the passages and therefore restricts the movement of the stool, urine, and gas. So hopefully now, in looking at the composition of these tastes, the effect, the potency, and the qualities that we know that are associated with this, now this post-digestive effect should make sense as to why it will have this particular effect on the doshas. So then when we mean post-digestive effect, we're basically looking at how that substance is going to then affect the doshas that are already there. Okay? So for instance, if you are a person who is pitta prakriti, or you have a condition where there is more amount of pitta is aggravated, then eating sour substances that will have then a sour vipaka will obviously aggravate pitta even further. So therefore, you do not want to consume sour substances if you are a pitta prakriti or if you have a pitta aggravation. Okay? Similarly, if you have a pitta aggravation, you are more probably better off to consume something that has a madhura vipaka, because what that will do is it will help to reduce the aspects of pitta because of the fact that it is more sweet in nature. Sweet, actually, remember, sweet helps to pacify pitta, even if it is in the aspect of rasa or in the aspect of vipaka. There also it helps to pacify pitta. So that's why we look at this vipaka as an important aspect, okay? Because it's basically telling us how it affects the doshas. So this is just an example of prabhava. Prabhava is the specialized pharmaceutical activity. So for instance, if you have something that has a rasa, madhura rasa, it is having guru or heavy qualities, heavy and unctuous. If it is having shita virya, and if it is having madhura vipaka or sweet post-digestive effect, then it is understood that these are all things that are conducive or similar to kapha, so therefore it should aggravate kapha. But sometimes, every now and then, you have these other special qualities of a particular substance that, despite having all of these rasa, guna, virya, vipaka that are logical to aggravate that dosha, it still has the ability to not aggravate that dosha. It's not necessarily there in all substances, but some substances have these special qualities. So when it does have that, it is very clearly indicated in the classical text as prabhava. It is a specialized pharmaceutical activity. So for instance, examples of this is amlaki, which is a predominant sour substance. Amlaki is the gooseberry, okay? So it is a very sour substance, but even though it has a sour substance, it's sour taste, it has a madhura vipaka, and also it actually pacifies pitta. It does not aggravate pitta. So you would think something that is sour should aggravate pitta, but amlaki is an example of something that doesn't. You would also think, again, a sour substances, which we had looked at in the earlier, we had looked at here, sour vipaka actually helps to reduce shukradhatu, and it's not as nourishing, right? Whereas amlaki, being a sour substance, is actually a rejuvenative. It is rasayana, which means it helps to nourish all the dhatus, including shukradhatu, and in fact, it helps to build ojas. So therefore, ideally, looking at this substance, other things that are sour may fall into the line of being aggravating pitta and not good for shukradhatu and may not necessarily have these qualities. But in this instance, amlaki has the prabhava, or the specialized quality, of still being able to be very nourishing, be an immunomodulator, helps in increasing the ojas in the body. Okay, so that's what we mean by a specialized pharmaceutical activity. Another example is ghee. Ghee is a substance that is a fat. It is a oily, fatty substance. However, even though being an oily, fatty substance, you would think that would suppress the agni. However, ghee is the one type of fat that actually in smaller quantities increase the agni. It does not suppress the agni. All other types of snehas will actually help to decrease or pacify or somewhat lower the agni. But ghee is the one fatty substance that does not do that. If it is taken in small quantities. If it's taken in large quantities, it'll do the same thing. But if it's taken in small quantities, ghee can actually increase your agni as opposed to suppress your agni. Okay? And shigru is another example of drumstick, which is very ushnavirya, but also again helps to increase the shukradhatu. Okay. So this was the last one I want to get to before we finish for today. This was a common question. I had a couple of people ask me this, which I believe is number 26 or 24 in your, I think it's number 24, the 3 stages of digestion. And how is that really, what are the 3 stages of digestion? So remember when we had talked about in the beginning of the doshas and the predominance of dosha according to different stages and different times? We talked about kapha always being there in the beginning, pitta in the middle, and vata in the end. And that refers to the time of the day, the time of the night, the stage of your life, and the stage of digestion. Hopefully this should be ringing a bell by now. So even in the stages of digestion, it's still the same thing. In the beginning part of digestion, you will have the kapha stage. In the middle part of digestion, you will have the pitta stage. And at the end of, towards the end of digestion, you will have the vata stage. Okay? So this is actually known as Avastapaka, where they talk about the different avastas, or avasta basically means stage. So the 3 different stages during the process of breakdown and transformation and assimilation of food are kapha, pitta, and vata. In the kapha stage is immediately after you consume the food. That's the first part. So when you take the food in, when you're chewing it and you're swallowing it, that time you're actually inducing more amount of saliva. You're actually helping to moisten the food even more. And at that time, it tends to, even though it has all of these, it may have all 6 tastes, or it may have 2, or may have 3. But at that time, with the combination of the saliva and combination of the kledaka kapha, the food tends to be more predominant in sweet taste, or madhura. And because of that, because of that particular stage, it tends to be more heavy, more satisfying. So you ever notice, this again is another example of why immediately after you eat food, you tend to feel a little bit heavy, a little bit satisfied, and maybe even a little bit sleepy. Okay? Because that indicates that it is the rise of kapha, or the predominance of kapha at that particular stage of digestion. If you just hang on for those first 10 minutes or first 15 minutes after you've had your food, then at that time, that kapha stage passes and you enter into the pitta stage. That's when it starts to really churn and break down. And that's typically what happens when it's there in the stomach. It's churning, it's mixing with the pachaka pitta, and it's really starting to break down and become more liquidy and more frothy. That is described in the classical text. They say that, as it churns, it becomes more liquid and more frothy, and it tends to be more predominant in sour, which is basically indicating the pachaka pitta that is mixing with the food. So that at that particular time, that is considered the pitta stage of the food. Okay, a pitta stage of digestion, sorry. So that time when it's churning in the stomach, that is the pitta stage of digestion. Then after that, once it exits out of the stomach and it goes on to the later parts of the GIT, or it goes to the Pachyamanashaya, which is basically the intestines. Then that is considered going on into the Vata stage, where it starts, that liquefied food then starts to be broken down and separated. It's starting to then divide and separate, and in the process also be broken down, and it gets dried out. In all of this process, it's being separated, broken down, and then it's being absorbed. The nutrients from that is being absorbed, and then you're left with the gross waste product from the food, which means it's getting dried out, stool is being formed. At that point, it tends to be more pungent qualities, or pungent taste tends to be more predominant, and that's when it is the Vata stage of digestion. Okay, so I hope this now makes sense, that you have even in the stages of digestion, you have the Kapha stage, you have the Pitta stage, and you have the Vata stage. Okay, so Kapha comes first, then Pitta, then Vata. Okay, so that basically covers quite a bit of, I think more than half of your study guide. I will go through the study guide list again and see if there are any things that which topics we haven't covered, and we'll make sure and be able to cover that in the next session. And of course, please feel free to send me questions apart from what is there on the study guide. If there are any topics that you're not sure about and that you would like to have to review, then we can try and get to that in the next webinar. Okay? So before we end, does anyone have any questions you would like to ask right now? Okay. Well, either this was a lot of overload or it was either very clear. On the stages of digestion, is there a sense of how long each stage lasts? It isn't necessarily about time, because if we look at, depending on the type of food that you eat, the stages of digestion may either be shorter or longer. So for instance, after our Thanksgiving meal, that's always our go-to example. If after the Thanksgiving meal, that kapha stage may last much longer than the pitta stage, or may take much longer before it gets to the pitta stage, because the food itself is more heavy. The food itself tends to promote more of the kapha qualities. So the kapha stage of digestion will prolong instead of easily moving on into the pitta stage. Another example is if you're eating food that is predominantly pitta aggravating. So for example, if you're eating chili, or if you're eating rasam, which is a type of really spicy soup. If you're eating a very spicy tomato soup or chili, these are things that really aggravate pitta, that tend to have very high pitta qualities in the cuisine. So when you consume that, it tends to make the kapha stage of digestion very short and go directly into enhancing the pitta stage of digestion, where there is more amount of acidity. In fact, it may aggravate pitta for it to be not just a normal pitta predominance in digestion, but become aggravated pitta at that point. Okay? And then it may take a little bit longer before it'll move on out to the vata stage. Okay? But there isn't necessarily an exact time. It always depends on what the person is consuming. Cognitive senses are listed under Sattvika side on the chart, but they seem more physical to me than tanmatas, which are more subtle. That's a great question, because in looking at the philosophy of it, it's actually the tanmatras come first. So for instance, if we look at in the example of every substance is innate in its causative factor. It stays latent in its causative factor. So for instance, a seed is latent or a tree is latent within the seed before it gets germinated and produces a plant, or before it becomes a tree. So the fact is, the seed has much more power and quality than that of its byproduct or plant. Okay, so even though the seed may look small and minute, within that seed, it has the capability of producing a tree. Similarly, the tanmatras, though they seem subtle, they're the ones that, from the tanmatras, you get the origins of the 5 elements, which are very gross. So in that, you consider the tanmatras are a little bit, they're subtle, but they're not less than the elements. They're actually greater than the elements. Does that make sense? Because it's not necessarily only the physical of being able to, they're not necessarily physical and tangible that you can see it or you can observe it, but you know the existence in the ability to create, basically. Okay. Okay, so I hope you all have a really good night, and I will see you again in 2 weeks, and we'll continue from there. Okay, good night.